17. Carleton, Washburne. Education to Save Democracy. The usual confidence of educators in democracy is not always to be found in the writings of Carleton Washburne, born 1889, whose educational experiments in the Winnetka, Illinois schools were a highly prized specimen of progressive education. Washburne did not attempt to transcend his day, but sought to work in terms of it as effectively as possible. He was not hostile to democracy, and was indeed more than ready to be congenial to it. He showed not even the slightest tendency to indulge in the backward look. On the other hand, he was thoroughly alive to the perils of democracy and its instability, and his concern was to educate the citizens of democracy to use their power wisely. Commenting at some length on H.G.F. Spurrell's Modern Man and His Forerunners, Washburne noted in 1928 that the downfall of each civilization has been due either to invasion from the outside or to the rise of the masses within. This downfall has usually been preceded by the decay of civilization and the internal collapse of the ruling power. Such decay of civilization from within confronts us today. From the few, power has passed to the many. The franchise has been gradually extended until every adult votes, women as well as men. In no previous civilization, Spurrell points out, has there arisen within a democracy, in its later stages, any centralizing or unifying force sufficient to give the weakened body politic new power. With the removal of dangers from without, with the rise of individual opportunity and power within, the units of civilization pull apart. Selfish ends replace service. City competes against city, class against class, interest against interest, individual against individual. There comes the time when to each member of the community, of the nation, of the civilization, his own immediate needs and desires transcend those of his group, of his class, of his nation, of his race. For every leader strong enough effectively to coordinate the efforts of unselfish individuals, there are self-seeking interests to set up counter-movements able collectively to overcome and destroy the effectiveness of that leadership. Like an individual suffering from senile decay, the body politic becomes, once more, merely a number of members unable to coordinate. Dissolution is the result. That is the history of every civilization of which we have record, which, overcoming outside dangers, has perished from within. That is the danger our civilization is facing today. That is the danger which education, through developing people more capable of cooperation, must help us avoid. It is no longer possible to prevent the masses from gaining control in our civilization today as they have done in the past. Even if it could have been prevented, it is doubtful if such prevention would have been desirable. Our hope lies in training continually greater numbers to use power wisely when they have it. In other words, education alone can save democracy from itself. This task was Washburne's concern. It can be argued that this unhappy view of democracy represented the opinion of Myron M. Stearns, his collaborator. On the other hand, Washburne and Stearns were in sufficient agreement to have collaborated also on a series of articles for Collier's Weekly and on an earlier book, New Schools in the Old World, 1926, a study of the progressive schools of Europe. Washburne did not hesitate on his own to state opinions which, while sometimes reflecting common educational practice, were not readily owned up to by other educators. In Winnetka, candidates for the Board of Education were hand-picked by a caucus and had little trouble in gaining election. Washburne believed in a strong superintendent always, and he associated progressive education with authority and responsibility in the person of the superintendent of schools. He believed in one-man control. He was hostile to the undermining of authority and responsibility in the name of democracy. On the other hand, he opposed any dictatorial hold on that office. While the superintendent and his administrative and advisory staff should be the experts to determine the value of a teacher to your children and to the school organization, the teachers themselves are the experts as to whether the superintendent and members of his staff are giving them the help, the stimulus, the understanding, and the freedom necessary for them to do their best work. Therefore, I would propose, and have actually inaugurated it in my own schools, the right of the teachers to recall the superintendent or any other person in an administrative or advisory position. However, the Winnetka Board of Education adopted a much milder policy in this matter than Washburne's radical proposal. Another unusual aspect of the Winnetka experiment, begun in 1919, was that it began in the planning stages with the desire of well-to-do parents to start a private school that would fit their children for Eastern colleges. One parent objected to the plan and suggested rather that the public schools be made good enough for our own children to go to. This then was the beginning of the Winnetka experiment, and with all its zeal in progressive education, it never lost this orientation towards Eastern colleges. It was to be a thoroughly modern system embodying the latest ideas in education, and democratic since public, but still with an orientation upwards. It was progressive, and half the school day was formally devoted to master factual information, and the other half given to creative and socializing activities. But there was no fixed commitment with regard to any progressive practice. In practice, books were important, and unlike some progressive educators, Washburne did not try to devaluate books and gave attention to children's reading. A strikingly different aspect of Washburne's approach to the problem was the fact that, while clearly a strong adherent of the new movement, he did not despise or take time to criticize the older education. Washburne was more concerned with doing the properly fitting thing for his particular day and age, and in terms of particular and changing circumstances. In terms of this, he was a faithful progressive educator, and perhaps the most consistent pragmatist of them all. The Winnetka experiment had two goals in mind, among other things. 1. To make much greater adaptation to individual differences than is customary in public schools, and 2. To provide more time for socialized and self-expressive activities. Washburne had no desire to diminish the educational content, but rather to heighten it by means of interest replacing discipline. Like other educators, he believed in guiding and developing the child's interests, but he did not decry discipline in the process. He failed, however, to reckon with the decline of discipline that would follow such an emphasis on the child's interests, because, however much the child's interests are guided, he is aware very quickly that his interests, rather than guidance or discipline, is the principle of legitimacy. The ends of education, as seen in The Aims of Better Schools, Washburne cited as 1. Soundness of body. 2. Skill of muscle coordination of hand and mind. 3. Efficiency in a vocation to which one is naturally adapted. 4. Hobbies for wise use of leisure time. 5. Mastery of the tools of learning. 6. Knowledge of essential facts as determined by research. 7. An inquiring mind, interested and alert. 8. Ability to pursue knowledge independently. 9. Contact with life. 10. the habit of settling social problems thoughtfully and in the light of knowledge. 11. Large group consciousness, or a realization of the interdependence of mankind. 12. Emotional control and development with freedom from harmful inhibitions. The 11th aim became steadily more important to Washburne, and in 1928 it was still central. In Babylon there was universal education. All people knew how to read and write and figure. The fact provided no safeguard against the obliteration of that great civilization. Our one safeguard consists in developing what Franklin Bobbitt of the University of Chicago calls the large group consciousness. Washburne failed to explain how the family, tribe or nation-conscious man who still destroyed the unit he made central would be preserved from destroying a world order despite his allegiance thereto. Moreover, despite a certain detachment that marked much of his thinking, Washburne did share many of the presuppositions of progressive education. Every child is a person, a living, growing human being with the right to physical and mental health, with the right to happiness. Our schools must be organized and conducted to help every child who enters their walls to live wholesomely and in a way that is fundamentally and lastingly satisfying. He thus held to the child-centered emphasis and, at the same time, the society-centered emphasis, and believed that the two movements are complementary. But the two can be complementary only if society assumes more and more responsibility and leaves the individual more and more quote-unquote free to be an irresponsible child who concerns himself with rights rather than responsibilities. It means some degree of socialism, and Washburne refusing to see socialism as an all-or-nothing idea, for public schools are socialistic institutions approved of the spread of government control in necessary areas as need arises. Washburne had confidence in the outcome of the child-centered approach. Experiments conducted with children who were given at weaning age a free choice of foods indicated some self-regulation of diet in terms of instinctive or psychological needs. The environment was controlled, as Washburne indicated, and candy in between meals barred. But he believed that with similar control and similar freedom, a degree of natural self-regulation in the child would lead to a healthy education. As a practical rather than theoretical pragmatist, Washburne tried to avoid preconceived standards, and hence his statistical norm was the average person. Why he should be in any sense normative and why statistics should have any weight, we are not told, at any rate in terms of this. All the rest of us are deviates. All education is therefore education of deviates. From this concept of norm stems the common classification of the gifted child as abnormal because a deviate from the norm. Since external norms are barred, although why internal norms are more valid, we are not told, three major needs appear in children which education must minister to fulfill the needs of the child and his self-regulating nature. The first major need of every child is self-expression. By this, Washburne did not mean undisciplined self-expression, and he was critical of some progressive schools for so interpreting it, but rather self-expression related to social living. A sense of security is the second of the child's rights and fundamental needs. Security, however, must not be confused with overprotection or overindulgence, or even absence of risk. It means rather a fundamental at-homeness in one's environment, a sense of certainty that one is loved and wanted, a feeling of confidence in oneself, and a recognition that others have confidence in one. The sense of security is the feeling of a firm foundation under one's feet. One may leap off it, but he knows that when he comes down, the solid ground is there to rest on. The third essential need and drive is social integration. Man finds his security only as part of a social group. Social integration means the identification of oneself with the group of one's fellows and identification of one's happiness and well-being with those of the group to which one belongs, and with more and more inclusive groups. It is not necessary to challenge the necessity of these three things to differ with Washburne. Important as these things may be, are they the responsibility of the schools? Indeed, is there not a danger of destroying the child by attempting to accomplish these things institutionally? Does the school cure in cases where these needs are lacking, or does it often aggravate an existing ailment? Furthermore, what about the basic educational needs of the child? The mind of the child seems to be forgotten in this scheme of things. But, states Washburne, children are constantly rendered maladjusted by inadequate or faulty homes and parents. The teacher must thus be trained in the principles of mental hygiene to aid these maladjusted children. From teacher to nurse to psychiatrist, a chain of reference must be established. Psychiatric service should be available to all schools for the more serious cases of maladjustment. Mental hygiene, as well as sex education, must be taught in the schools and is their responsibility. It should be required, and in Winnetka, unless the parents, by interview, assured me that they would give their children complete, frank sex education at home, it was required. As Washburne observed, few parents wanted the embarrassment of such interviews. By conferences, parents should be educated into the philosophy and practice of the schools. Washburne does not mention another logical step. If the state through the school has so vast a right to the child, why not require the couples to request permission and again instruction before having a child? If the state has a right to the child after birth, it logically has a right to the child before birth. The socialization of the child means also the socialization of the parent. Sooner or later, states develop their every claim. And yet, in spite of his radical demands for the school's control over the child, Washburne tried to hold to individualism. It is not the well-rounded individual we want, but the fully developed individual, developed along his own lines. This individualism, however, is set in the context of an organic concept of the unity of society, even as, in biological evolution, cells are first independent, then grouped but unspecialized, then more and more highly specialized and interdependent until they are incapable of separate existence. So man has developed from first independent individuals, then grouped for mutual protection, but with little specialization, then more and more specialized and interdependent. Now, if you would be capable of sustained independent existence, this means that man no longer can call his life his own. He is merely a cell in a body, and his individuality is merely his particular function to the body. Thus, Washburne ends up with mass man in spite of his desire to transcend him. For Washburne, the social sciences must teach that, in the long run, his good is the world's, and the world's good is his own. Such a view is the triumph of the state over man, who is totally absorbed into the group. Lacking a higher law than the group or world, he cannot, in the name of his insignificant cell-like particularity, challenge the right of the whole. The life is in the organism as a whole, and right and wholeness go hand in hand. Washburne, however, trusted that the individual would still find self-realization in the group. His definition of democracy returned to this theme. Fundamentally, democracy is a way of life that gives every individual the utmost possible opportunity for self-fulfillment as a member of an interdependent society. This involves freedom, social responsibility, that is, realization of one's identification with the society of which one is a member, the subordination of temporary to permanent values, and of individual and small group action to large group purposes, and the ability to cooperate with others in work and in thought, and to play an active part in determining the social, political, and economic life of society, and understanding. It should be noted that democracy is seen primarily as a way of life rather than a form of government, and the role of governing is given minor attention as a form of social responsibility. Indeed, Washburne believed in the prior right of experts in matters of government. Thus, he held that student courts were a misapplication of democracy, in that students are incompetent to judge. This is true also of civil judges, whose role is one of the worst features in our present political democracy. True democracy is not necessarily political democracy. Expert psychiatrists and criminologists should have the sole right to decide what is to be done with the violator in order to rehabilitate him and make him into a good and useful citizen, and in the meantime, how society can best be protected from his possible depredations. Washburne's democracy thus shares the fate of all democracies. It begins as the ostensible triumph and freedom of the people, and ends with them ruled by a new oligarchy whom they must obey as true democratic authority more intensively than any previous power demanded. The masses must do their work as faithful cells of the new Leviathan, be fed, content, silent, and obedient. Washburne's confidence in this society grew rather than diminished, and his earlier doubts grew fainter, and his confidence that evolution would be stepped up by democratic interdependence became marked. He appealed for faith in man's potentialities for mutual helpfulness and ever-increasing wisdom, warning that if man failed to learn swiftly to adapt to his fellow man, he will destroy the interdependent civilization he has built. However critical the situation, still, human evolution has been accelerating more and more as man's interdependence has increased. Interaction and interdependence must lead to, and social integration consists of the identification of oneself with one's fellows. The Bible defines love thy neighbour as thyself as meaning obedience to the second table of the law, that is, respect for the life, home, property, and reputation of others in word, thought, and deed, Romans 13:9 and 10. For Washburne, however, love of neighbour means social integration, a radically different thing. Democratic living is not majority rule, therefore, but a way of life. Differences in people are necessary in a true democracy because every organism consists of different cells performing their functions differently and coordinating these functions. This differentiation is essential to the life of the organism. It is to be expected that Washburne would be strongly in favour of the United Nations, a great organism in the making. His view of the Russian Revolution was not sympathetic, and he insisted on the right to wage war, being definitely not a pacifist. But his view on the constituency of the United Nations was far from pessimistic. He saw its differences not so much as a basic cleavage, but as potentially reconcilable points of view. This, then, was Washburne's cure for the rise of the masses. As in other instances, it remains questionable whether the cure is any improvement on the disease.